I forgot to tell my daughter that I had fixed the smart doorbell at her new house. When I accidentally reviewed the footage from the following days, I was horrified to discover a terrifying truth about my daughter's fiancé. He was trying to make all of his crimes look like nothing more than accidents. No matter the cost I now have to bring this headless demon to justice, I truly appreciate you being here. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from today? Share your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Some elements are dramatized for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental. The darkness in my study was as thick as tar, but it was nothing compared to the icy dread radiating from the phone screen in my hand. I am Thaddeus Hardy, a 67-year-old retired harbor pilot with hands calloused by decades of sea spray and eyes that can still spot a rogue wave long before it hits the hull. I have spent my life reading the shifting currents of the Savannah River, but tonight the storm was inside my own home. My fingers trembled as I navigated the smart doorbell app, my breath hitching in the humid Savannah night air. On the screen, the timestamp read 2 a.m. from the previous night. The blue light of the display reflected off my wrinkled face, illuminating the bitter taste of betrayal that had begun to coat my throat like soot. At first, I thought the audio was just the usual distortion from the distant surf. But then I realized the truth. Caius Irvine was standing so close to the porch microphone that his whispers were unnervingly crisp. Caius is 35, the perfect fiancé to my daughter Lavinia, a yacht broker with a blinding white smile and a tailored suit for every occasion. I once thought he was the safe harbor she deserved after her mother passed. But the man on the screen was a stranger with a soul of hollow glass. He was leaning against the railing, his phone pressed to his ear, his polished mask replaced by a look of predatory calculation. He spoke about a plan in Charleston, his voice cold as a winter gale mentioned gas leaks and described the need for speed. He boasted about how Lavinia believed his every lie, calling her trust the ultimate lubricant for the machinery he was setting in motion. I felt a surge of nausea. My daughter was not a person to him. She was an insurance payout waiting to be collected. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath hitched in my throat. The world outside continued its indifferent rotation, but my internal world had just suffered a catastrophic collapse. I stared at the man I had shared Sunday dinners with, watching him pull a folded piece of paper from his inner pocket. It looked like a copy of a new life insurance policy, one I knew Lavinia had signed just weeks ago under the guise of marital planning. He spoke into the phone again, his words sharp and jagged. He was confirming a time for Saturday night, 9 o'clock, when the house would be quiet and she would be deep in her sleep. He told the person on the other end that everything had to look like a technical failure, a tragic accident caused by a faulty connection. The rage that followed the shock was a slow, burning heat, the kind of anger that only a father who has already lost too much can truly understand. I watched his face closely, every line of his manufactured handsome features now appearing hideous to me. He was a broker of death selling my daughter's life for a commission I could only imagine. I gripped the phone so hard, the glass groaned under my thumb, the smell of my forgotten cold coffee lingering in the air. I wondered if I had ever truly known him, or if I had simply seen what I wanted to see, because Lavinia was happy. How could a human being wear the face of an angel while harboring the soul of such a ferocious demon? I zoomed in on his eyes, hoping to find a flicker of hesitation, but there was only the void. Suddenly, Caius stopped talking. He leaned forward, his face filling the frame of the doorbell camera. For one horrifying second, he looked directly into the lens, his lips curling into a sharp, knowing smirk that made my skin crawl. It was as if he could feel my gaze through the digital ether, a silent acknowledgement that the game was no longer a secret. Without breaking eye contact with the camera, his hand reached out, and the screen abruptly flickered to static. He had disconnected the device from the inside, plunging my digital window into total darkness. The screen of my phone went black, reflecting only my own wide, terrified eyes. He knew I was watching. Or worse, he had already begun to set his plan in motion. I stared at the dead screen for a long minute, my mind racing back to the toolbox sitting on my workbench, and the morning 3 days ago when I first felt the itch of suspicion. I gripped the screwdriver in my hand, feeling the cold metal push back against the tremor of my old age, much like how I was currently trying to push back against this brutal truth. The memory of that morning at Lavinia's coastal villa was still sharp-colored by the pale, low-slung sun of a Georgia dawn. Lavinia Hardy, my only daughter, is 32 years old. She is an ecological restoration specialist, with a sharp mind and hair usually pulled back in a practical, restless ponytail. But lately her eyes have carried the heavy shadow of someone trying far too hard to be happy, a performance that I have watched with growing concern. That day the salt air was thick, leaving a briny taste on my lips as I stood on her porch. She was inside, frantic about her sick cat, the faint smell of antiseptic drifting through the open doorway. I had noticed the expensive smart doorbell was malfunctioning, its casing oxidized by the relentless Savannah salt. I told her I would fix it, knowing my hands were more meticulous than any high-priced contractor Caius might hire. I pried the device open, expecting to find corroded wires. Instead, I saw something that gave me pause. The damage wasn't natural. The internal sensors looked as though they had been deliberately tampered with a physical obstruction placed specifically to disrupt the recording field. Someone didn't want to be watched. Savannah's sea salt doesn't just corrode steel. It creeps into every crevice of a house, gnawing away at the peace Lavinia so desperately craves. I worked in silence, the rhythmic click of tiny electronic components, providing a fragile anchor to my wandering thoughts. I decided to do more than just a simple repair. Using the skills I'd honed over decades of managing complex harbor systems, I bypassed the faulty firmware and installed a much more sensitive recording patch. I wanted it to be a silent gift, a hidden layer of security for my girl. As I reached into the narrow gap near the doorframe to secure a loose wire, my fingers brushed against a small, cold object. I pulled it out, a glass vial with no label containing a few clear, scentless drops of liquid. I frowned, tucking it into my pocket, as curiosity began to sour into a dark, shapeless doubt. What was this? Lavinia didn't use unlabeled medication, and she certainly wouldn't leave it on the floor of the porch. The sun beat down on the back of my neck, but I felt a sudden, distinct chill. I finished the hardware installation and pulled up the app on my phone to sync the new settings. My breath hitched when the admin screen loaded. Lavinia's master account had been accessed recently, and the recovery password had been changed from an unrecognized device and IP address that didn't belong to her or her office. A noise behind me made me spin around, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was no one there, only the restless sea breeze whistling through the porch rafters. I shook off the feeling of being watched and looked back at my phone. The system was now fully operational under my private override, a secret bridge I had built without even knowing I would need it so soon. My fingers were still numb from the cold metal as I packed my tools. The serenity of the coastal morning had been permanently fractured. Just as I was closing my bag, the distant crunch of gravel reached my ears. A sleek, high-end yacht brokerage car was slowly turning into the long driveway, its polished black surface gleaming like a beetle's wing in the afternoon light. It was him. He was early, and as the car drew closer, I could see he wasn't alone in the passenger seat. A heavy, oppressive feeling settled in my gut, the kind of instinctual alarm that had saved my ship from many hidden sandbars in the past. The black sedan came to a halt, the engine purring with a quiet, expensive arrogance that seemed to mock the modest silence of the surrounding marshland. The engine of the Mercedes-Benz cut out, leaving a ringing silence in its wake as the driver's side door swung open. I hate the way this man occupies space with his expensive cologne and a self-satisfaction so thick it makes my stomach churn. Caius stepped out, adjusting his blazer sleeves with the practiced grace of a man who has never known a hard day's work. But I was more interested in the passenger side. A tall man emerged wearing a baggy mechanic's jacket that looked absurdly heavy for the sweltering Savannah afternoon. This was Elias, a brooding figure with dull gray eyes that never once met mine. At that moment, standing on my daughter's porch 3 days ago, I had no way of knowing Elias was the same shadow I would later see in a horrifying Doorbell recording. But my gut was already knotting itself into a tight warning. Caius walked straight toward me, his leather soles clicking against the wooden porch, with a sharp, intrusive rhythm that drowned out the comforting sound of the nearby surf. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he looked at my tool bag with a thin, condescending smile. "Did you break something else, Thaddeus?" He asked, his voice smooth as oil and just as slippery. "I told you I would hire a professional for house repairs. There was no need for you to trouble your aging hands with this hardware." I felt a surge of heat crawl up the back of my neck, the kind of slow-burning anger that comes from being patronized in my own child's home. I simply tightened my grip on the screwdriver. "Just a few loose screws, Caius," I replied, keeping my tone level. I find that I'm still quite useful when it comes to spotting things that aren't working the way they should. Why did my daughter choose a man who carried the scent of hidden agendas instead of simple sincerity? It was a question that had been gnawing at me for months. But seeing him with this Elias character made the doubt feel like an anchor dragging behind my ribs. Elias stood near the entrance, motionless, watching the driveway like a sentry rather than a friend. He was a jagged piece of a puzzle that didn't fit into the coastal serenity of Lavinia's life, radiating a silent menace that made the salt air feel suffocating. Caius checked his gold watch, a clear signal that my presence was no longer required. "Lavinia is resting, and she has a very important dinner tonight to discuss our future," he said, his tone shifting to a dismissive finality. "We really should be getting her ready, so perhaps you should head back to your own place now, Thaddeus." I took my time, meticulously wiping each tool before placing it in my bag. I wanted to see more. I intentionally fumbled my pouch, letting a handful of metal washers scatter across the porch floor. Elias moved then surprisingly fast for his bulk, stooping down to help me gather them. As his hand reached out, his jacket sleeve slid back, exposing a rough, dark tattoo on his wrist, a broken anchor. My breath hitched. That symbol was unmistakable. It was the mark of those dishonorably discharged from the maritime police units I used to oversee men deemed too volatile for service. You know, sometimes an old man's intuition isn't the onset of senility, but the soul's alarm bell ringing in the dark. I took my bag from him, our eyes finally meeting for a second, and I saw a void there that chilled me more than a winter gale. I walked down the steps, the heat of the afternoon pressing against my chest like a physical weight. Caius didn't even wait for me to reach my truck before he ushered Elias toward the house. The heavy front door shut with a resounding thud that felt like a gavel coming down. I paused at the edge of the gravel driveway, pretending to adjust my side mirror. Through the narrow gap of the side gate, I caught a final glimpse of them. Caius didn't go inside to check on Lavinia as he had claimed. Instead, he gave a sharp, imperious nod to Elias, gesturing for the man with the broken anchor to head toward the back of the property, straight toward the area where the main gas lines fed into the villa's foundation. The flashback dissolved with a jolt, dragging me back to the suffocating silence of my dark study. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic ache that reminded me I was no longer the young man who could chase down a harbor thief without breaking a sweat. I sat in the shadows for a long time, the taste of sea salt and suspicion still lingering on my tongue. I must have drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep, the kind where the mind refuses to fully disengage from the world. The alarm from my phone tore through the stillness of the bedroom at 3 a.m, sounding as sharp and violent as a gunshot inches from my ear. I lurched upright, cold sweat soaking the back of my undershirt. I fumbled for the device, my vision blurring as I opened the hidden Doorbell app for Lavinia's house. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy infrared world of grays and blacks under the flickering street lamps of Savannah. A hooded figure stood on the porch, his movements twitchy and anxious. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes catching the infrared light and glowing with the predatory sheen of a wild animal. When he stepped closer to verify his location, the light hit his face. My blood froze. Marsden was a short, thick-set man, with a face deeply pitted by acne scars, a man I had purged from the Savannah Port Authority 10 years ago for his chronic addiction and technical fraud. He was a disgraced gas technician who knew exactly how to make a system fail without leaving a fingerprint. The static hum of the phone's speaker was the only sound in my room. My blood felt like it was turning to ice. The man standing there was Marsden, the butcher of pipelines, a ghost from my professional past, who had no business being at my daughter's door. I watched breathless as the front door creaked open, just enough for a pale hand to reach through the gap. Caius didn't step outside. He stayed in the safety of the dark interior, extending an arm to receive a small black plastic package from Marsden. They spoke in hushed, jagged fragments that the sensitive microphone I had installed picked up with terrifying clarity. "Is the dosage right?" Caius whispered, his voice stripped of its usual charm. "I don't want her waking up halfway through this." Marsden gave a jagged, nervous nod, his fingers trembling as he tucked a roll of cash into his pocket. "Don't worry," he hissed. "This stuff will make her heart stop as quietly as a battery dying in a clock. No coroner in the state will find a trace of it." My skin crawled with a nauseating mixture of disgust and pure fatherly rage. I wanted to scream, to reach through the glass and wrap my hands around Caius's throat, but I was paralyzed by the digital distance between us. Could a father truly stand by and watch death knock at his daughter's door without lifting a finger? The thought was a physical weight crushing the air from my lungs. I watched Caius pull the package inside, but instead of retreating, he stepped toward the lens. He looked directly at the hidden camera, a chilling, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He knew. He had always known I was there. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached up and yanked the power lead from the internal chime box. The screen on my phone stuttered once, then turned into a void of blackness. Connection failed. The display mocked in sterile white letters. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness. My bare feet felt the biting chill of the floorboards as I stood up, my senses suddenly hyper-alert. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat in my ears, but beneath it I heard something else. A faint, rhythmic scraping sound was coming from the window of my own bedroom, just beyond the heavy velvet curtains. Someone wasn't just at Lavinia's house. They were here. I didn't have time to grab my shoes. My hand went instinctively to the heavy ebony cane resting against the nightstand. I held my breath, my fingers tightening around the cold wood, ready to crush anything that dared to poke its head through the vibrating window frame. I pressed my back against the wall, the chill of the plaster seeping through my thin undershirt. The scraping sound was deliberate, a rhythmic taunt against the glass. I realized with a sudden jarring clarity that this noise was too obvious for a true assassin. Marsden wasn't trying to break in and kill me. He was playing the role of a distraction. By drawing my attention to the window, he gave Caius the window of time needed to hack into the local power grid. Just as I prepared to lunge at the curtain, the streetlights outside flickered and died, and the steady hum of my refrigerator vanished into a tomb-like silence. He had systematically blinded the neighborhood, severing my digital eyes at the exact moment I turned my back on the monitors. A police cruiser's blue and red lights suddenly reflected off my neighbor's brick wall, a stroke of pure luck as it patrolled the nearby alley. The silhouette outside my window vanished into the shadows instantly. I didn't wait to see if Marsden would return. I stumbled through the dark to my study, my bare feet finding the familiar path. My computer sat on an independent power supply, and its cooling fan began to whir with a lonely mechanical persistence in the dead house. My hands were trembling as I navigated the local cloud cache, desperate to recover the last fragments of audio before Caius could scrub the servers clean. The truth is, like an iceberg drifting in the Savannah River, What I had seen on the porch was only the glistening white tip, while the mass beneath was large enough to sink us all. Finally, the recovered audio bit through the speakers. "Charleston is finished." Caius's voice boasted, distorted by static but unmistakably arrogant. "Key West went just as smoothly. Savannah will be the final masterpiece." A dry, metallic taste of fear filled my mouth. I turned to the digital archives of regional newspapers, my fingers flying across the dusty keys. I searched for gas leaks, fatal accidents, and wealthy single women. The results made the air in the room feel thin and toxic. November in Charleston, a socialite dead from a faulty stove connection. April in Key West, a boutique owner lost to a pilot light mishap. In both cases, the estates were massive, and the grieving widowers had vanished with the inheritance before the ink on the death certificates was dry. "He is a serial killer," I whispered to the empty, shadowed room. "My daughter isn't a bride to him. She is just the next number on a ledger written in blood." Every timeline matched. Every method was identical. 2 corpses, 2 leaks, 1 husband. It was the devil's own recipe. The horror was no longer a suspicion. It was a proven formula, and my Lavinia was the prize in his final act. I reached for an old external hard drive on the corner of my desk, Lavinia's old backup, that I had been repairing for weeks. I began to dig through the encrypted folders, my eyes stinging from the harsh white light of the monitor. As I cracked the final subfolder, a wedding photo bloomed across the screen. It wasn't Lavinia. It was a woman in Charleston, radiant in white lace, standing next to a younger, hungrier-looking Caius. The timestamp on the file showed she had died exactly 14 days after the ceremony. I leaned back, my heart thundering so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. Suddenly, the screen flickered. A new message notification popped up from Lavinia's private account, but the syntax was cold and surgical. "Do not go looking any further, Father," the text read. "You should start preparing for the funeral instead. It is better that way." My old hands stopped shaking. When fear reaches its absolute peak, it transforms into a terrifying sort of calm that settles deep in the marrow. Caius's threat was still dancing on the monitor, glowing with a sterile white light that seemed to mock the thick darkness of my study. He made a grave mistake, thinking that the prospect of my own death could slow me down or dampen my resolve. A father who has already tasted the bitterness of loss has nothing left to fear except the ultimate failure of failing his only child. I ignored the message entirely, my fingers moving with a cold, renewed precision across the keyboard as I dove headfirst into the digital archives of coastal newspapers. My journey took me through the ghost-filled pages of the Charleston Gazette and the Key West Citizen, looking for the echoes of past tragedies that I knew were hidden there in plain sight, waiting to be unearthed by someone with nothing to lose. Under the dim yellow glow of my desk lamp, the patterns began to emerge like skeletal remains rising from a receding tide. I found the first case from 2021 in Charleston, then another from 2023 in Key West. Both victims were wealthy, independent women who had recently married a charismatic younger man. They died in quiet domestic accidents involving gas leaks. My breath hitched as I realized this was not just a series of crimes, it was a production line of death. What truly chilled me was the fine print. In both instances, the forensic reports had either been conveniently lost or altered right before the cases were closed. I stared at a grainy photo of a broken safety valve from the Charleston scene. Why would the local authorities ignore such a blatant sign of tampering? How many lives had been traded to fatten this monster before he set his sights on my daughter? The question burned in my throat like acid. I dug deeper, cross-referencing the internal staff lists of the local gas companies in those cities during the months leading up to the accidents. A name leaped off the screen, hitting me like a physical blow. Marsden. That disgraced technician hadn't just been a local nuisance. He had been a seasonal contractor in both Charleston and Key West at the exact times those women died. This was no longer just about a lone predator. This was a system. It was a terrifying revelation to find that the insurance firm providing the massive payouts for both previous cases was the very same company where Caius Irvine served as a senior consultant. Every murder was a high-yield investment, laundered through the very industry meant to protect the vulnerable. The corruption didn't just sit on the surface. It ran through the pipes and into the boardrooms, turning grief into cold, hard profit for an invisible network of vultures. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the shutters, the truth felt sharp and cold as a scalpel stripping away the Irvine family's perfect facade to reveal the rot underneath. I felt a strange vibration on my desk. It was an automated email from the Savannah Port Authority's security system. My heart skipped a beat as I read the notification my private personnel file had just been accessed. The login didn't belong to a stranger or a hacker, but to a high-ranking internal account belonging to a man I had respected for 30 years. The net wasn't just closing around Lavinia, it was tightening around my neck too. I began to pack my essentials, moving through the shadows of my home with a heavy leaden heart. I had to get to her before the masterpiece reached its finale. I reached for my car keys, my mind racing. Just as I stepped toward the door, the sharp, shrill ring of my landline telephone shattered the morning silence. I froze my hand, hovering over the doorknob. The caller ID didn't show Lavinia's name. It was a direct line from the Savannah Sheriff's Office. I stared at the ringing phone for a long, agonizing minute, sensing that this was no ordinary inquiry. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched the landline scream on the desk like a venomous snake coiled and ready to strike. The caller ID confirmed my growing dread. It was the Savannah Sheriff's Office. When I finally lifted the receiver, the voice on the other end was cold and bureaucratic, belonging to Deputy Brown. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He warned me that a formal complaint had been lodged against me regarding illegal surveillance and unauthorized access to my son-in-law's private security feeds. "Mr. Hardy," he said, his tone sharpening, "monitoring the private lives of others is a felony even when they are family." I felt a surge of white-hot fury. "You are protecting a monster, Miller." I snapped back, but the line went dead before I could finish. I realized then that Caius Irvine's influence had already reached the local authorities. I grabbed my car keys and rushed toward the garage, determined to reach Atlanta. As I pulled out onto the driveway, the steering wheel shuddered. I stopped and found a precise, shallow slit in the sidewall of my front tire, a slow-release death sentence intended for the high-speed curves of the interstate. Caius was no longer just watching. He was actively orchestrating my physical removal from the board. I swapped the tire for the spare in a frantic, sweat-soaked blur and roared toward Atlanta. The 4-hour drive was a hellish nightmare of adrenaline and the sharp smell of burning rubber as I pushed the old engine to its absolute limits. By the time I reached Lavinia's upscale apartment complex, my hands were cramped and my mouth tasted of dry metal. I burst into her home, my eyes wild, spreading the printed articles and forensic reports from Charleston across her pristine white marble kitchen island. "Look at this, Lavinia," I pleaded. "The same gas leaks, the same insurance payouts. It's a pattern of slaughter." My daughter looked at me not with fear of Caius, but with a devastating, pitying sadness that hurt more than any threat. Lavinia marched me to the entrance and shut the door. My world was suddenly locked outside the truth. "Dad, stop this," she had whispered before the wood clicked shut. "You've been so lonely since Mom passed. Caius just sent me a photo of his business meeting in Charleston. You're seeing ghosts because you want him to be the villain." To her, I was just a broken man losing his grip. I stood in the cold hallway, the salt of helpless tears stinging my eyes. How can I save someone who is willfully blindfolding themselves in front of a firing squad? The sterile, fluorescent light of the apartment corridor felt like a laboratory, magnifying my utter isolation. As I had turned to leave, my gaze caught a glimpse through the still-closing door of a black plastic bag, sitting prominently on her kitchen counter, the same package I had seen Marsden handle in the dead of night. When I asked what it was, Lavinia had dismissively called it health supplements Caius bought for her. The realization that the poison was already inside her sanctuary made my stomach churn with a visceral nausea. I started toward the elevator, my mind a chaotic storm of desperate plans. Ding! The elevator doors slid open with a cheerful electronic chime that felt like a mockery of my despair. I froze. Stepping out of the polished metal interior was Caius Irvine himself. He wasn't in Charleston. He was standing 5 feet away from me wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. He didn't look surprised or angry. Instead, he flashed that flawless, predatory smile, the one that never reached his eyes, and nodded toward me as if he had been expecting my arrival all along. The smell of peppermint from his breath drifted toward me, masking the scent of the death he carried in his pockets. He looked at me with a terrifyingly calm gaze, as if I were merely a nuisance he was about to sweep away. Caius approached me with a measured grace that set every nerve in my body on edge. His breath carried the sharp scent of peppermint and a metallic undertone of death that he couldn't quite mask. That flawless smile did not reach his eyes. It stopped at the corners of his lips, frozen and jagged like a piece of broken glass aimed directly at my throat. He held out one of the steaming coffee cups with the mock humility of a saint. "You look exhausted, Thaddeus," he said, his voice a smooth, low purr. "The long drive from Savannah must have taken a toll on a man of your vintage." Before I could respond, he leaned in closer, and the burnt ash smell of the coffee became overwhelming in the sterile white light of the hallway. He subtly tilted his phone toward me. On the screen, a red pulsing dot traced the exact location of my car downstairs. I had been tagged with a GPS tracker before I even left my driveway. He knew every mile I had covered, every minute I had spent grieving over the Charleston archives. "I know what you did at the coast, Caius," I hissed, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to remain calm. "I know about Marsden and the insurance fraud." My fingers felt numb, a tingling sensation spreading up my arms as the predatory stillness of his gaze pinned me to the wall. He just chuckled, a hollow sound that echoed off the granite tiles. "Proof is a fickle mistress, old man. Right now, you just look like a concerned father who forgot to take his medication. Is there a deeper pain than watching your own flesh and blood hand her life over to an executioner and call it love?" The question haunted me even before the door behind me swung open. Lavinia stood there, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and burning rage. The sound of her heels clicking on the polished floor was as sharp as a gunshot. I had my hand gripped tight on Caius's tailored lapel, a desperate, pathetic attempt to force a confession from a ghost. "Dad, stop this right now," she screamed, her voice echoing through the corridor. She saw my desperation and labeled it madness. She saw his calculated silence and labeled it patience. Caius adjusted his tie with a sigh, looking at her with a fabricated expression of weary concern. I tried to explain about the black bag, the supplements, and the bodies in Charleston, but the words felt like dry husks in my mouth. I saw the bitter taste of betrayal in the back of my throat. She didn't want the truth. She wanted the comfort of the lie he had sold her. "If you take one more step into our lives," she declared, her eyes cold, "as winter Atlantic water, I will call the police and file a restraining order. I will consider myself a daughter without a father." My heart felt as though it were being crushed by an invisible, calloused hand. I had lost her. Everything blurred. My vision swam as the weight of my failure settled into my bones. I had been outplayed by a man who treated human souls like line items on a balance sheet. I was a relic of an old world trying to fight a digital demon with paper and ink. As Lavinia pulled Caius back into the apartment, he turned his head just enough to give me a final victorious wink. Through the narrowing gap of the closing door, I saw her reach for that black plastic bag on the counter. She pulled out a container of what he called supplements and swallowed a pill without hesitation. her eyes fixed on him with a terrifying devotion. The door slammed shut, the sound final, as a tombstone being set in place. I stood alone in the hallway, the LED lights overhead buzzing with a low, taunting hum. The elevator doors opened with a mocking chime, and I stepped inside, my body moving on autopilot. When the doors opened again in the lobby, the afternoon sun blinded me for a moment. But as I walked toward the exit, I saw it. The patrol car Miller had warned me about was idling by the curb, its blue and red lights beginning to rotate in a slow, rhythmic dance of impending capture. The blue and red lights reflected off the glass lobby doors like rhythmic pulses of spilled blood, a silent warning that the net Caius had cast was finally tightening around my throat. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, their hands resting on their holsters with practiced indifference. Their gazes locked onto me like predators who had finally cornered their prey in a concrete cage. I felt the heat rising from the patrol car's engine, a faint smell of burning plastic and hot oil mingling with the stale Atlanta afternoon air. They didn't draw their weapons, but the psychological pressure was immense. We received a report of a subject acting erratically and making threats. The taller officer set his voice a flat, robotic drone. "I need to see some ID, Mr. Hardy." I felt a bitter laugh bubble in my chest. "Erratically, my son-in-law is a cold-blooded killer, and you are harassing the only man trying to stop him." I reached for my wallet, my movements slow and deliberate while my phone began to vibrate in my pocket with a persistent, aggressive rhythm. My screen lit up with image notifications from an unknown number. They were high-resolution photos of me taken just seconds ago, standing right here in the lobby under the watchful eyes of the law. The caption below was a killing blow. "The game is over, old man." I looked up and saw a figure standing on the 12th floor balcony, a silhouette of calculated calm against the jaundiced, sickly yellow light of the setting sun. My phone rang. I answered it, and Caius's voice came through, stripped of the charm he used to deceive my daughter. It was thick with a heavy, suffocating malice. 10 years, Thaddeus. A decade of lies exploding in my mind all at once. He didn't even deny my accusations. Instead, he whispered a truth that turned my blood to ice. "Your wife's accident at the port wasn't a failure of the safety valves," he said, the speaker crackling with a distorted electric hiss. "It was my entrance exam, my first trial for the syndicate. You should have died with her." I bit my lip so hard I tasted the metallic tang of blood. "I will not let you touch a single hair on Lavinia's head," I vowed, my voice a low, dangerous growl. He just laughed. "You have until Saturday night before her own accident occurs. And by the way, look behind you. Elias is closer than you think." I felt a sudden sharp chill crawl up my spine. The shadows in the corner of the lobby seemed to shift, and I realized a man was standing there, partially obscured by a decorative pillar. It was the man with the tattoos, the one I knew as Elias. He was watching me with a vacant, predatory stare. Caius is not a human being. He is a parasite that has been feeding on the life of my family from the inside out for far too long. One of the officers stepped closer, ostensibly to check my driver's license, but his body blocked the view of the security cameras. As he handed the plastic card back, I felt him slip a small, folded piece of paper into my jacket pocket. "Don't trust anyone here. Run," he whispered so low I barely heard him over the hum of the city. He then stepped back, deliberately creating a gap in their perimeter by turning to speak into his shoulder radio. It was a chance, a sliver of an opening in a world that had become a trap. I didn't wait to ask why. I turned and walked toward the parking lot, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My vision was blurred by a toxic mix of rage and terror, every shadow looking like a reaching hand. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, the scent of the evening air turning foul. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached for the door handle. I stopped dead. Standing there, leaning casually against the hood of my vehicle, was Elias. He wasn't hiding anymore. In his hand, He held the same black plastic bag I had seen at Lavinia's apartment, its dark surface glistening in the dying light. Elias stood there as motionless as a statue carved from pure hatred. The black plastic bag in his hand swayed gently, keeping a rhythmic haunting time with the shallow breathing of death. He slowly pulled a small, glinting object from his pocket, the light catching a jagged edge that made my pulse spike. "Who do you think this bag is for, old man?" He asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. My survival instinct, forged through decades of Port Authority management and the hard lessons of age, kicked in before my mind could overthink the danger. I didn't retreat. I lunged forward, surprising us both. I reached into my coat and pulled out the small canister of homemade pepper spray I had carried since the first threats began. I caught him square in the face. As he roared and clawed at his eyes, the bag dropped to the pavement. I caught a glimpse of what was inside. It wasn't poison or a weapon. I saw my own leather-bound journal from my nightstand in Savannah and a framed photograph of my late wife. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They had already violated the sanctuary of my home. "You think you can hide?" Elias growled through the haze of chemicals. "I will send you to hell before you ever touch her." I didn't stay to argue. As we struggled, I managed to snatch his unlocked cell phone from his other hand, spinning away and bolting toward the industrial stairwell of the parking garage across the street. My lungs felt like they were being shredded by hot glass as I pounded up the concrete steps. I could hear his heavy boots slamming against the floor behind me, the sound of a predator closing in on its wounded prey. Run. There was no other choice but to run. I ducked into a cramped technical service room on the third floor, a labyrinth of humming pipes and thick cables coated in decades of dust. I pressed my back against the cold brick wall, trying to stifle the sound of my ragged gasps. The air in here smelled of old grease and stale ozone. In the darkness, the phone in my hand vibrated. The screen glowed with a sickly blue light, revealing an active call on speaker. It was Caius. He clearly didn't realize Elias had lost the device. I held my breath, the silence in the room so heavy it felt like it might collapse my chest. Caius was talking to someone else on the other end, a voice I recognized instantly as Marsden. "The old man is in Atlanta," Caius said, his tone devoid of its usual artificial warmth. "Don't wait until the end of the month like we planned for Charleston. Move the timeline up. He knows too much. Everything in Savannah needs to be finalized by this weekend." I listened as they discussed the mechanics of murder, with the casual indifference of men reviewing a quarterly budget. Marsden's voice was thin and nervous, questioning the speed of the operation. "I want it to look like a perfect, unavoidable gas leak," Caius commanded. My blood turned to ice as the scope of the conspiracy widened. Caius mentioned that he had already paid off the shift supervisor at the Savannah Fire Monitoring Center. They would delay the emergency dispatch by 15 minutes once the sensors tripped. 15 minutes. Do you know how much life turns to ash in 15 minutes of calculated abandonment? It is more than enough time for a house to become a crematorium. My vision blurred as I realized my own home was the target, and Lavinia was being groomed to be the grieving beneficiary of another insurance payout. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Caius wasn't just a man. He was a parasite that had drained the soul of my family while I was busy looking at files. I stared at the phone as the call finally disconnected my fingers, trembling so hard I nearly dropped it. A notification appeared on the screen, a single unread text message from a contact, saved only as L. My heart stopped. It was the initial of my daughter Lavinia. I stared at the screen, the letters swimming before my eyes, wondering if my own flesh and blood was the victim I thought she was, or a willing participant in this nightmare. The letters on the screen blurred before my tired eyes. L, could my little girl truly be a victim? Or was she a willing participant in this grand, macabre play? Doubt is a specialized kind of acid. It was eating away at the image of my daughter, faster than anything Caius Irvine could ever devise. I did not linger in the safety of that technical room. I clutched the stolen phone, and the data drive recovered from Lavinia's home heading straight for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Atlanta. My hands shook on the steering wheel, fueled by a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and the terrifying weight of the truth. I had to reach someone before the walls closed in completely. The drive was a fever dream, a blur of taillights and morning fog, but I made it to the sterile, imposing lobby of the GBI just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. Helene Price is a GBI agent in her 50s, with flinty, short-cropped hair and eyes that carry the ghosts of 100 unsolved cases. She was an old contact from my years managing the port, a woman who knew that my word was usually as solid as the concrete piers I oversaw. "Helene, you have to believe me," I said, leaning over her desk while the scent of antiseptic and fresh printer paper filled the air. I looked like I had crawled out of a trench, my clothes disheveled and my eyes bloodshot. "Thaddeus, you look like you just walked off a battlefield," she replied, her voice cautious. I laid out the stolen phone and the drive explaining the network of insurance-based murders. Her skepticism wavered when she pulled up the message from L. I watched her face pale as she cross-referenced the number. "Thaddeus, this isn't Lavinia," she whispered. "This is Logan, a code name for a dirty cop in Savannah we've been tracking for months. He is the inside man. Justice in this state is like a hall of mirrors. You think you have finally found the exit, but you are really just crashing into another illusion." The realization that the corruption went that deep made the room feel smaller, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering with a taunting rhythm. Helene called in a technician to scrub the drive I had brought. While the keys clattered in the background, I recounted the call between Caius and Marsden, detailing the plan for the delayed fire response in Savannah. We watched as the files began to populate the screen. It was not just a list of vulnerable women from Charleston or Key West. My heart hammered against my ribs as names of local politicians and influential businessmen began to appear under the heading of potential liabilities. This was not just simple murder for profit anymore. This was a systematic purge disguised as a series of tragic accidents, a way to remove anyone who stood in the way of Caius's expanding empire. Have you ever felt like you were screaming in a room with no oxygen? The air felt thin as I realized the magnitude of the monster I was fighting. Helene stared at the screen, her composure finally shattering. "Why is Congressman Vance on a list of Caius's insurance clients?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because this is not just about the money, Helene. It is about the silence," I replied. The bitter cold coffee on the desk tasted like ash. Suddenly, an alert flashed on her computer, an urgent high-level override from her superiors. My breath hitched. The screen displayed a formal order to cease all investigations related to Caius Irvine and his associates, citing matters of national security. The system was not just slow, it was actively protecting the predator. Helene looked at me with a sudden sharp flash of terror. She did not say a word, but she licked her dry lips and slowly pushed the hard drive back across the table toward me. "Run, Thaddeus," she hissed in a breathy whisper. "They are not coming to assist us. They are coming to recover the evidence." I did not wait to see who they were. Just as I tucked the drive into my coat, the heavy double doors at the end of the hall swung open. Two men in sharp black suits, faces as expressionless as stone, stepped into the light. I did not wait for them to speak. My hand reflexively clamped onto the data drive hidden beneath the interrogation table, my muscles coiling like an old beast backed into a corner. I watched the lead man's hand slowly reach toward the lapel of his tailored suit, a gesture as cold and deliberate as a surgical strike. These men did not carry the weary weight of civil servants. They radiated the sharp, expensive lethalness of private security professionals. I realized then that they were not from the government at all, but shadows sent by the very insurance conglomerate Caius served, a force powerful enough to walk through the doors of the GBI-1 as if they owned the building. Before they could close the distance, Helene Price acted with the sharp instinct of a veteran agent. She intentionally swept a heavy stack of folders off her desk, the loud crash echoing like a gunshot through the small room. "Go now," she hissed, her eyes locking onto mine with a desperate urgency as she pointed toward the rear service door of the interrogation suite. I bolted the soles of my shoes, slapping against the linoleum in a frantic rhythm of survival. I could hear the muffled shouts of the men behind me, but I didn't dare look back. Helene caught up to me at the threshold of the back exit, her breath hitching, as she shoved a freshly printed manila folder into my chest. "This is everything I could pull before they locked the system," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "Caius Irvine is a ghost, Thaddeus. 5 years ago in Philadelphia, a female billionaire died in a gas explosion that looked exactly like this. He was the prime suspect, but the case was buried by people with more money than God. Don't let Savannah become his next cemetery. Philadelphia. Blood and fire." He had practiced his craft on the lives of those closest to him. I burst through the heavy fire doors and into the humid Atlanta morning, my lungs burning with the sharp, metallic taste of fear. I reached my car and threw the folder onto the passenger seat, tires screeching as I pulled out of the GBI lot. Once I reached the anonymity of the interstate heading south toward Savannah, I dared to flip the folder open with one hand. The crime scene photos from 5 years prior were a mirror image of the sketches I had seen on Marsden's desk. The same valve placements, the same calculated delay in the alarm systems. Caius was not just a murderer. He was an artist of the accidental tragedy, a man who transformed domestic safety into a weapon for the elite. I felt a bitter cold clarity settle over me. "You have done this before, you devil," I muttered under my breath, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Tomorrow night he intends to turn my daughter into his latest masterpiece. Caius is like a Category 5 hurricane, and I am driving straight into the eye of the storm. The scent of stale coffee and old paper from the folder filled the car, a sensory reminder of how close I was to losing everything. As I rifled through the back of the file, a small handwritten note fell out onto my lap. It was a detail Helene must have found in the original Philadelphia case file. The victim of that explosion 5 years ago was Caius's own half-sister. He had launched his career by slaughtering his own blood to secure a multi-million-dollar inheritance. My stomach turned, the realization of his depravity making the world tilt on its axis. He didn't just lack a soul. He possessed a hunger that could never be satisfied. When I turned to the final page of the folder, my heart stopped. Taped to the back was an old, grainy black and white photograph. It showed a younger Caius standing on the familiar piers of the Savannah port. Standing beside him, with an arm draped over his shoulder in a gesture of paternal mentorship, was my old partner, the man who supposedly died in a freak loading accident 10 years ago. Cold sweat soaked my steering wheel. That photograph was no mere coincidence. It was a death warrant that had been deferred for 10 long years. The past does not sleep. It lies in wait within the shadows, lurking until you think you are safe, only to rise and throttle the present with the cold hands of the departed. I pulled my car onto the gravel shoulder of I-16, the tires crunching like breaking bone. I stared at the grainy image of a younger Caius, his eyes already gleaming with that predatory, sharp intelligence, standing beside Frank. Frank, my old partner at the port, the man whose death I had carried as a burden of guilt for a decade. I remembered the official report, a tragic loading accident, a failure of communication. But as I looked closer at the documents Helene had provided, my heart stopped. Frank's signature on the safety reports from that year was wrong. I had seen enough of his handwriting to know the slant was off. It was the same deceptive flourish I had seen on Caius's modern insurance contracts. Frank had not been careless. He had been eliminated, and his death was the first stepping stone for Caius to infiltrate Savannah. Anger, hot and primal, finally scorched away the last of my fear. "Frank, you weren't to blame," I whispered into the empty cabin of the car. "He was there from the beginning. If the system is this rotten, if the law has been bought and paid for, then I will be the one to clean it." I realized I could no longer play by the rules of men who protected monsters. I drove into the outskirts of Savannah as the sky bruised into a deep, sickly purple. I didn't go home. Going home was a trap I couldn't afford to spring. Instead, I found a dilapidated motel that accepted cash and didn't ask for a name. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap lavender cleaner, but it was a fortress for the night. How many lives are enough for a demon's ambition, 110, or an entire city? The rhetorical weight of the question pressed down on me as I laid out my purchases on the moth-eaten bedspread. I had spent the last of my liquid cash on high-grade surveillance gear, miniature hidden cameras, professional-grade recording devices, and a sensitive gas pressure sensor. I sat under the flickering fluorescent light, sketching the floor plan of Lavinia's apartment from memory. I knew exactly where Marsden would strike. He wouldn't just blow the place up. He would manipulate the line in the utility closet to create a slow, undetectable leak. My plan was not to stop the surge immediately, that would only delay the inevitable. I needed to record the act. I needed a silent witness that could not be bribed, threatened, or intimidated by any court in this state. This was the final gamble. A single mistake, and both Lavinia and I would be nothing but ash and bone. Tick-tock. The clock on the wall felt like a blade scraping against my throat with every passing second. I began testing the audio receivers, adjusting the frequencies to cut through the static of the motel's aging wiring. As I swept the room with a portable signal detector, a high-pitched whine suddenly pierced the air. My blood ran cold. The signal wasn't coming from the motel walls or the television. It was emanating from the very briefcase containing the data drive I had taken from the GBI. I tore open the lining of the case, my fingers trembling, as I found a tiny adhesive tracking device tucked into a seam. It had been there since Atlanta. They hadn't just let me go. They had let me lead them. A sudden flash of red light caught my eye from the motel window. I moved the curtain just an inch. A sleek black sedan had drifted into the parking lot, its headlights cutting off as it glided into a spot directly facing my room. It sat there idling silently like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I was no longer the hunter. I was the prey, and the cage was closing in. I killed the lights in the small motel room, my hand reaching instinctively for the spare handgun tucked beneath the thin pillow, the cold bite of the metal grounding my frayed nerves. I did not retreat from the shadow cast by the black sedan in the parking lot. Instead, I gripped the folding knife in my pocket, preparing for a hunt where the prey was about to change roles. My first instinct was that Elias had finally caught up, but as I adjusted the curtain an inch, the street lamp caught the distinct crest of the Savannah Sheriff's Department on the door. It was Deputy Miller, a man I knew to be on Caius's payroll, sitting there like a loyal hound. He wasn't there to arrest me. He was there to ensure I didn't interfere with the weekend's bloodbath. I moved with a silence born of desperation, turning on an old battery-operated radio to a talk station to simulate a presence in the room. I slipped out through the narrow bathroom ventilation window, dropping into the damp grass of the alleyway. I had already secured a rusted maintenance van under a false name, and inside was the uniform of a utility contractor. My hands remained steady as I pulled on the heavy canvas jacket and tucked my hair beneath a grime-streaked cap. Sleep well, Miller, I thought as I bypassed the parking lot. I have an appointment with my son-in-law, and I only need 30 minutes to rewrite the ending of this tragedy. Driving through the quiet streets of Savannah felt like navigating a graveyard before the stones were even laid. I arrived at the townhouse Lavinia shared with Caius, watching from a block away, until I saw her small SUV pull out of the driveway. She was heading to the market, a routine she never broke on Saturday mornings. The coast was clear, or as clear as it would ever be. Click. The sound of the lock turning felt deafening in the morning stillness. I was inside the tiger's den. I moved with practiced efficiency, the screwdriver slick with the sweat of my palms as I worked. I began installing the miniature cameras within the vents and the dark recesses of the smoke detectors, ensuring the lenses were aimed at the key transition points of the house. When I reached the kitchen, the air grew heavy with a sharp, pungent odor that made my eyes water, the acrid scent of concentrated acid. I knelt by the gas intake behind the stove and saw the nightmare made manifest. The copper pipes had been deliberately thinned with corrosive chemicals, a technique Marsden used to ensure a pipe failure looked like natural wear. They were really going to do it. Those animals were going to burn my daughter alive for a payout. This trap was not just for her. It was the final solution for a meddling father, too. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the depth of the betrayal. How far had she been manipulated to sign her own death warrant? I began to search the kitchen drawers for any sign of her awareness and found something that turned my blood to ice. Tucked beneath a stack of takeout menus was a new will bearing Lavinia's neat signature and dated just 2 days ago. It left every cent, every share of the Port Authority inheritance, and all personal property to Caius Irvine in the event of her accidental death. The document was a masterpiece of coercion, a suicide note written in legalese. I felt my chest tighten with a rage so hot it threatened to choke me. I finished the last of the camera syncs, my hands trembling as I checked the feed on my handheld monitor. Everything was in place for the silent witness to speak. Suddenly, the silence of the house was shattered by the rhythmic metal scrape of a key sliding into the front door lock. It was far too early. Lavinia should have been gone for another hour. Through the gap in the kitchen door, I didn't see my daughter. I saw a man in a tailored charcoal suit, his movements slow and predatory as he began to peel off his black leather gloves one finger at a time. I held my breath, pressing my body into the cramped, dark space beneath the kitchen sink, where the stench of rust and mildew filled my lungs. The hardwood floor groaned under the weight of my son-in-law, each footstep echoing like a hammer strike against my raw nerves. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing my muscles to remain still against the cold, jagged pipes. Caius was so close I could hear the rhythmic rustle of his charcoal suit. He began to whistle a light, haunting classical melody, a tune that felt like a mockery of the domestic peace he was about to shatter. Through a hairline fracture in the cabinet door, I watched him reach for the gas stove, his fingers trailing over the dials with a lover's touch. He paused, leaning down to adjust something near the floor, and I saw a small glint of silver fall from his hand. It was one of my own cufflinks, a distinctive anchor design he must have pilfered from my study weeks ago. He left it there, a silent piece of perjury intended to place me at the scene of the accident. "A little wine to add some drama, shall we, my dear?" he murmured to the empty room. He opened the pantry directly adjacent to my hiding spot to retrieve a vintage bottle. I felt the vibration of the cabinet door inches from my face. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird pleading for release. "Don't open this door." I thought the metallic taste of fear sharp on my tongue. "Don't look down." After a moment that felt like an eternity, he walked away, his footsteps fading as he headed upstairs to change. He knew I had been here. Or perhaps he simply assumed I would be. The short shock of that realization galvanized me. I didn't wait for his return. I slipped out from under the sink, my joints screaming in protest, and vanished through the back service entrance. I retreated to the rusted maintenance van parked 2 blocks away, fumbling for my tablet in the shadows of the cabin. The blue glow of the screen was a dim sanctuary in the dark. I pulled up the live feed from the hidden cameras I had just installed, my pulse finally beginning to settle into a cold, hard rhythm of resolve. On the screen, the front door opened. Lavinia was home. I watched Caius descend the stairs, now dressed in a relaxed linen shirt, greeting her with a kiss so tender it made my stomach turn. He began to lay out the dinner table under the soft glow of candlelight, placing the crystal glasses right next to the stove, where the gas was now hissing with a faint, steady whistle. "A little surprise for you tonight," he told her, his voice dripping with manufactured affection. It was a macabre theater of the absurd. Seeing her smile at him, treating the wolf like a guardian angel, ignited a protective fury in me that burned hotter than any gas fire. This digital screen is the only lens keeping me from rushing back in there to tear that demon apart. I watched as he poured the wine, the clear ring of crystal hitting crystal echoing through my headset. Then his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper as he leaned toward her. "I've taken care of everything, Lavinia. Your father's troublesome files at the GBI. They won't be a problem anymore." He said it like a romantic vow, a promise of a clean slate that was actually a death sentence. My hands shook as I realized the depth of the void I was staring into. Then the air in the van seemed to vanish. On the monitor, Caius suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He didn't look at Lavinia. He slowly, deliberately turned his head toward the ceiling, his gaze locking directly onto the tiny lens hidden within the smoke detector. A slow, terrifying smirk spread across his face. He raised his wine glass toward the camera, tilting it in a mocking toast, as if he were clinking glasses with me through the digital divide. That wink across the digital divide was the starter's pistol. I could not stand by for another second, yet I was frozen by the chilling precision of his movements. I held my breath, my trembling finger hovering over the record key on my console. The line between a mere seeker of vengeance and a final witness was now measured only by the click of a mouse. Caius had known I was watching. He had performed that romantic dinner as a staged play to lull me into a false sense of security. But even a predator as calculating as he is suffers from the rot of arrogance. He assumed the bathroom was the only sanctuary left where he could shed the mask. After leaving Lavinia in a deep drug-induced slumber, thanks to a mild sedative he had slipped into her wine, he retreated into the master bath. Through the pinhole lens I had secreted into the ventilation grate, I watched him loosen his silk tie. The transformation was instantaneous and sickening. The warmth he had radiated downstairs evaporated, replaced by a crystalline coldness that made my skin crawl. He leaned into the mirror, wiping away the sweat of his performance, his expression turning into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. "Sleep well, little princess," he whispered to the empty room. "By morning you will be a shining star, in the most literal sense. You did well today, Caius. Very well." He was talking to himself, a man in love with his own reflection and the trail of wreckage he left behind. He turned on the hot water and thick billows of steam began to fill the small space, turning the scene into a hazy, purgatorial nightmare. Despite the white noise of the rushing water, the hypersensitive microphone I had planted caught every syllable of his muttered calculations. He began to talk numbers, his voice humming with a rhythmic greed that felt like a physical weight on my chest. Can you hear it? The sound of gold coins clinking over the corpse of an innocent woman, $3.5 million. That was the figure. He had secretly raised the limit on Lavinia's life insurance policy months ago, treating my daughter's life as nothing more than a high-yield investment. He chuckled, a dry and hollow sound that vibrated through my headset. "Poor, pathetic Thaddeus," he sneered, looking directly into the steam-fogged mirror. "You will spend your final days rotting in a cell, convinced that your own hands caused the leak that killed her." That is my true masterpiece. The framing was complete in his mind. He had already cast me as the negligent, broken father who would take the fall for his surgical strike. My rage reached a boiling point, a concentrated fire that burned away the last of my tactical patience. I was no longer just watching a criminal. I was watching the architect of my family's annihilation. I watched as he reached into his leather wallet and pulled out a small, tattered object. It was an old photograph of my wife, Sarah, the only piece of her I had left that wasn't a memory. My breath hitched as I realized he had kept it as a trophy, a memento from the tragedy 10 years ago at the port. He stared at her face for a moment, not with regret, but with the cold satisfaction of a collector. Then, with a casual flick of his wrists, he began to tear it. Rip. My past was being shredded between his manicured fingers. He tossed the fragments into the toilet and flushed them away without a second thought. Rip. My history was being erased in a display of petty, calculated cruelty. He stood there for a second longer, admiring the empty bowl before reaching out to turn off the faucet. The sudden silence that followed was deafening heavy with the scent of expensive soap and the metallic tang of impending death. Caius tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he looked precisely at the spot where the microphone was hidden. He leaned in close, his lips almost touching the grate. "I know you are listening, Thaddeus." He whispered, his voice a jagged edge in the quiet. "Why are you still sitting in that van? Why aren't you running to save her?" I burst through the van door, ignoring the cloak of darkness and the suffocating sense of danger that tightened around me like a coil. My world had shrunk to the size of a cold, indifferent phone screen, where the signal bars flickered like a death sentence hanging in the balance. Every nerve in my body was screaming for action, but the logic of a lifetime spent on the docks told me that blind rage would only lead to an earlier grave for both of us. I scrambled back into the driver's seat, the steering wheel slick with a cold sweat that seemed to seep from my very marrow. With trembling fingers, I redialed Lavinia's number. Each long, agonizing tone that vibrated through the speaker was a jagged blade twisting in my gut. "Please, Lavinia. Answer me, baby girl," I whispered into the void of the cabin. But there was no voice, only the mechanical repetition of a call that would never be answered. I checked my messages, hoping against hope for a sign, and then I saw it. A final text from her number sent just minutes ago. "Stop ruining my happiness, Dad. You're acting like a crazy person. Don't call me again." The words hit me harder than any physical blow. Caius hadn't just blocked me. He had systematically dismantled her trust, poisoning her mind until she viewed her own father's protection as a symptom of schizophrenia. I tried every social media app, every digital avenue I knew, but her accounts were ghost towns, either deactivated or locked down tight by the man now pouring wine in her kitchen. Silence. A deadly final silence settled over the line. I stared at the screen until the light faded, leaving me in total darkness. I was a ghost to my own child, a phantom haunting a life she no longer believed I had a right to be part of. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white, the smell of old upholstery and cold asphalt filling my senses. How many lives are enough for the ambition of a monster? Does he need a dozen, or is my daughter's soul the only currency he requires tonight? I looked out through the windshield, the dim streetlights of Savannah casting long, skeletal shadows across the road. 2 blocks away, a Savannah police cruiser sat idling at the mouth of the street. For a fleeting second, hope flared in my chest, a desperate ember in a rising tide of black water. But as I watched, the officer didn't move toward the house. He sat there, a silent sentinel positioned not to protect the residents, but to ensure that no one disturbed Caius's private theater. They were bought. Every layer of the system that was supposed to keep her safe had been greased with insurance money and political favors. I took my binoculars and focused on the house. Through the lens, I saw Caius's silhouette move across the window. He reached up with a deliberate slow motion and pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut, severing my last visual link to the interior. My hope was a candle flickering out in a cellar filled with gas, a tiny spark of light about to be swallowed by the dark. It was just me and him now. No law, no backup, no mercy. I checked my earpiece one last time, listening to the ambient noise from the hidden microphones. The hiss I had heard earlier, the one I thought was coming from the kitchen stove, had changed pitch. It was deeper, more resonant. It wasn't just the kitchen. The sound was vibrating through the central heating vents. The entire structure was being saturated. The house wasn't just a crime scene. It was a pressurized bomb waiting for a trigger. Suddenly, a bright blue spark arced from the main electrical junction box in the side yard. A sharp, dry snap echoed through my headset, the sound of a remote igniter being engaged. I checked my watch. I had less than 3 minutes before the pilot light, or a single stray spark, turned that beautiful home into a pyre. The roar of the truck's engine drowned out the frantic thumping of my heart. But it could not silence the imaginary ticking of the death clock, counting down inside that gas-filled house. I didn't tap the brakes. My aging legs floored the gas, aiming directly for the makeshift blockade the local police had established to keep me away from my own flesh and blood. I was a man possessed a father who had already seen one family member consumed by the shadows of the Savannah ports, and I refused to let history repeat itself in a pillar of fire. Just as the house came into view, a nondescript windowless van screeched out from a side alley swinging wide to bar my path with a violence that forced me to yank the wheel. I slammed on the brakes tires, screaming against the cooling asphalt, leaving a thick, acrid stench of burnt rubber in the air that seemed to coat the back of my throat. Marsden Trent stepped out of the van, moving with a predatory grace. Marsden Trent was a man with a face carved from cruel granite, his eyes as void of emotion as a cold ledger, looking at me like I was a clerical error he was sent to rectify. In his hand, he held a high-powered signal jammer, its red light pulsing like a heartbeat of malice. He wasn't there to save my daughter. He was the cleaner, the one sent to ensure the accident had no survivors to tell a different story. Not only was he jamming the signal, but I caught the glint of a secondary explosive charge in his other hand, a failsafe he intended to plant on the main gas valve. "Move, Marsden," I screamed, my voice cracking with a desperate rage. "You're murdering a family." He didn't blink. "Today is a beautiful night for a final rest, old man," he replied, his voice a flat, dead drone. He raised a suppressed handgun, aiming for my front tire, his finger tightening on the trigger with the cold indifference of a bureaucrat. Before I reveal the detail that changes everything about this standoff, if you're still watching this unfold with me, comment "stop" or "go" and add one reason for your choice. Please note, the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. What matters is the lesson behind it. Just as Marsden's finger began its final pull, the night exploded in a different way. Blinding floodlights erupted from 4 sides, cutting through the darkness like silver blades. The sudden glare caught Marsden in a crossfire of brilliance, turning his granite face into a mask of pure shock as the silence of the suburb was shattered. A chorus of sirens wailed to life, and the unmistakable voice of Helene Price boomed through a megaphone, commandingly firm. "Jub chati vibe on. Drop the weapon immediately, you are surrounded." I watched as a fleet of black SUVs and tactical units swarmed the street, moving with a precision that bypassed the local corrupt precinct entirely. Helene had bypassed the political rot of Savannah by calling in federal assets she had quietly assembled. Marsden realized the tide had turned in an instant. Instead of retreating toward his van, now boxed in by GBI cruisers, he threw the jammer into the brush and bolted toward the side of the house. Before the tactical team could intercept him, he kicked open the rusted storm cellar door and vanished into the darkness of the foundation. "Thaddeus, stay back." Helene's voice crackled over the radio, sharp with urgency. "We have the perimeter, don't go in there." But I ignored her. I knew that if Marsden reached the main gas valves in that cellar, he wouldn't just be escaping, he'd be finishing the execution. I saw Helene emerge from the lead vehicle, her face a picture of grim determination against the flashing blue lights. She later told me she had tagged the black sedan from our motel encounter with a reverse tracking device leading her straight to this hornet's nest. But the victory felt hollow, as a thick, sickly sweet smell of gas wafted from the second-story bedroom. I looked up and saw a shadow move behind the glass, Caius Irvine holding a silver Zippo, the flame already dancing on the wick. I did not wait for Helene's order. I surged forward, my boots pounding against the pavement, as I sprinted toward the house, my lungs burning with a mixture of cold night air and the phantom scent of fuel. The silence inside the house, transmitted through the surveillance feed on my handheld monitor, was far more terrifying than the GBI sirens wailing behind me. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a trap that had finally snapped shut. I watched the screen with wide, bloodshot eyes as Caius moved with a predatory smoothness through the living room. He picked up a bottle of Cabernet, the dark liquid swirling like a bruised soul within the glass. With his back to Lavinia, I saw his thumb flick open a small vial. He licked his lips as he dropped a finely crushed white powder into one of the glasses. It wasn't a common sedative. As the powder vanished into the crimson depths, I realized with a jolt of pure horror that he was using a powerful respiratory suppressant, a chemical anchor designed to keep her pinned in the depths of unconsciousness, even as the air she breathed turned into a lethal poison. "Drink this, honey," Caius said, his voice a honeyed rasp that made my skin crawl. "It will help you sleep. You've had such a long, taxing day. You deserve to rest." Lavinia looked up at him, her eyes soft, with a trust that felt like a knife in my chest. "You're so thoughtful, Caius," she whispered, taking the glass. "I really do just need some peace right now." I watched her tilt her head back. I watched her swallow the betrayal. My fingers dug into the frame of the monitor until the plastic groaned my soul, screaming at her through the digital divide to put the glass down, to run, to look at the man who was currently measuring her for a shroud. Her eyes closed. My heart seemed to stop in that exact moment. Within minutes, the drug began its brutal work. Lavinia's movements became sluggish, her eyelids fluttering as the weight of the suppressant dragged her down. She tried to shift on the sofa, a look of confused distress crossing her face as her limbs refused to obey her will. "Caius," she murmured, her voice thick and slurred. "Why is my head so dizzy everything is spinning?" He didn't answer with the truth. He simply leaned over her, his hands deceptively gentle as he eased her back against the cushions. "Don't fight it, my love," he cooed, stroking her hair with a tenderness that was more obscene than a blow. "It's just sleep. A long, beautiful, eternal sleep." He reached over her and pulled a handmade quilt up to her chin, tucking her in like a precious doll while he glanced at his gold wristwatch. The precision of it was agonizing. He stood up and walked toward the hallway, his fingers grazing the thermostat. I saw him reach down to the vents near the floorboards, his hand twisting the manual valves to ensure a steady, invisible flow of gas began to saturate the room. He was weaving a cocoon of toxic silk around my daughter, and I was nothing more than a spectator behind a glass cage watching the end of my world arrive in real time. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room became a countdown to annihilation. Caius reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded piece of stationery. He placed it carefully on the coffee table near Lavinia's limp hand. It was a suicide note, a forged confession stating she couldn't live with the shame and pressure of her father's supposed mental breakdown and constant harassment. He was going to kill her and erase her memory with a lie. Finally, Caius stood in the center of the room, looking not at his wife but at the clock. He pulled a chemically treated cloth from his pocket, pressing it firmly over his own nose and mouth. With his free hand, he unscrewed the cap of a small canister and began pouring a thin, shimmering line of accelerant across the hardwood floor. A fuse of liquid fire leading directly to the sofa where my daughter lay dying. I no longer heard Helene's megaphone or the frantic squawk of police radios. Every sense I possessed was focused on the heavy oak door and the small cellar window that separated me from a looming death. The hiss of gas snaking through the metal crevices sounded like the mocking laughter of a monster waking up beneath my feet. I threw my weight against the rusted latch of the storm cellar, my shoulders screaming in protest, as I forced my way into the bowels of the house. The air hit me like a physical wall, thick with the stench of rotten eggs and the chemical tang of impending disaster. In the dim light, I realized I wasn't alone. Marsden Trent was already there, moving through the basement like a shadow in a graveyard. He wasn't just working for Caius. As I watched him adjust a thermal detonator on the main line, the realization struck me with the force of a tidal wave. He had been sent by someone much higher up in the GBI, a third party, desperate to erase every trace of the Philadelphia investigation, which meant both Caius and Lavinia were merely loose ends to be burned away. He used a specialized tool to shear off the safety valves, ensuring there would be no mechanical trace of foul play. A little more pressure and boom, he muttered, his voice cold and clinical. No evidence, no witnesses. Caius is too theatrical. This job requires the finality of metal. I felt the adrenaline surge, hot and bitter. I lunged from the shadows, my boots skidding on the damp concrete. I knew a single gunshot in this atmosphere would turn the entire foundation into a crater, so I discarded my firearm and threw myself at him with the raw, desperate strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. We collided against a row of rusted pipes, the metal ringing out with a dull, hollow thud. Who is the hunter and who is the prey when the breath of death has already filled your lungs? Marsden was younger and faster, his movements honed by years of professional wet work. But I had the weight of 10 years of grief behind every blow. We grappled in the darkness, the only light coming from his dropped flashlight rolling across the floor, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the sweating pipes. He slammed an elbow into my ribs, and I tasted copper in my mouth as my vision blurred. "You're not leaving this cellar, Trent." I wheezed, my fingers clawing at his throat. He laughed, a short, jagged sound. "Old man, what do you think you can do? Beat me with your decaying bones." He twisted out of my grip, his eyes reflecting the pale beam of the flashlight with a terrifying emptiness. The basement was a pressure cooker, the concentration of gas so high I could feel it stinging my eyes and itching the skin on my arms. We were two ghosts fighting in a tomb that hadn't been sealed yet. I swung a heavy iron wrench I'd snatched from a nearby workbench, narrowly missing his temple. Crash! A fire extinguisher fell from its bracket, hitting the floor with a heavy clang. My only chance. I grabbed the heavy cylinder and swung it with everything I had left. Marsden ducked the metal, whistling over his head, and he countered with a kick that sent me reeling back into a stack of old wooden crates. As I struggled to find my footing, he stepped into the light, a look of twisted amusement on his face. He reached for a serrated combat knife, the blade glinting. "You want to know a secret before you die, Thaddeus," he hissed. 10 years ago, I was the one behind the wheel of that truck. Frank never saw me coming. Your partner, the man you trusted with your life, he's the one who gave me the keys." The words were a serrated edge through my heart. Marsden lunged the knife, grazing my shoulder, drawing a hot line of pain. But as he prepared for the killing blow, a sharp crackle echoed above us. A faulty fuse box, damaged in our struggle, spit a tiny, brilliant blue spark into the saturated air. The smell of gas became so dense I could practically taste it on my tongue, thick and oily. That spark was like the wink of a demon. I did not have a second to dwell on the burning ache in my shoulder. As that tiny blue light flickered in the gas-heavy air, the instincts of an old special operative screamed that the world was about to be ripped into 1,000 jagged pieces. The smell of gas was so thick, it felt like I was breathing in oil, coating my throat and lungs with a toxic weight. I lunged for a heavy red fire extinguisher mounted nearby, not to fight the fire, but to smash through the small, reinforced ventilation window above the main gas line. I swung it with a desperate bone-deep strength, the glass shattering and allowing a rush of night air to begin diluting the death trap. Marsden Trent tried to scramble toward me, his face a mask of homicidal resolve, but the sudden rhythmic thundering of GBI boots on the floorboards above distracted him. "You won't get a second chance to run, you animal," I roared, pivoting on my heels. I channeled every ounce of fury for Frank and every year of my own exile into a single devastating punch. I felt his cheekbone collapse under the heel of my palm with a sickening crunch. He collapsed against a rusted pipe, blood spraying from his ruined face. "Blow it." He spat his eyes wide and crazed. Let us all burn together. In that moment, I realized the ultimate irony. Caius's own remote igniter had been rendered useless by the very jammer Marsden had been carrying earlier. Caius was upstairs, a delusional king, holding a scepter that could no longer command the fire, while Marsden had planned to erase him, along with the rest of us, using his own thermal charge. Boom! The front door upstairs was blown inward by a tactical breach. Everything became a chaotic blur of smoke, shouting, and high-tensile steel. Before I reveal the detail that changes everything about this rescue, are you still following the trail with me? Comment justice or trap, and add a short reason why you think I should trust the GBI right now. Please note the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. What matters is the lesson behind it. Flashbangs erupted in the cellar, the blinding white light searing my retinas and leaving a high-pitched ring in my ears that drowned out the world. I saw the silhouettes of GBI tactical teams swarming down the stairs, their weapons leveled with terrifying precision. Marsden was slammed onto the cold concrete, the metallic click of handcuffs sounding like a final judgment. I didn't stay to watch them drag him away. I scrambled up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs, ignoring the agents shouting for me to stay down. I burst into the living room where the air was still hazy with gas. Helene Price stood at the center of the wreckage, her weapon aimed squarely at Caius Irvine. The man was a pathetic sight, his hands trembling as he clutched a silver Zippo that refused to spark his face pale with the realization that his masterpiece had turned into a cage. "Get him out of here!" I screamed, lunging toward the sofa. "My daughter? She's up here, save her. Have you ever seen justice take the form of cold, biting handcuffs?" I watched them tackle Caius, his screams of protest echoing through the house as he was hauled toward the door. I threw myself beside the sofa, the soft, limp form of Lavinia making my breath catch in my throat. I gathered her up, her body feeling dangerously cold and heavy. As the paramedics rushed in, I noticed Marsden being led past the window. He looked directly at Helene Price, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his bloody lips. To my horror, I saw Helene momentarily avert her eyes, her jaw tightening in a way that suggested a connection I wasn't supposed to see. I pressed my ear to Lavinia's chest, desperately seeking a heartbeat, but a faint vibration caught my attention. It was Marsden's phone lying forgotten on the cellar steps. A new message glowed on the screen. "Eliminate everyone, including Caius." The ambulance sirens wailed through the night, a discordant symphony of chaos that did nothing to settle the churning dread in my gut. Even as the emergency lights painted the neighborhood in rhythmic flashes of blue and red, the memory of Marsden's cold, dead eyes as he was led away in shackles burned behind my eyelids. My lungs felt as though they were being shredded by the freezing night air, each breath a struggle against the invisible remnants of the gas that had nearly claimed my daughter. I tightened my grip on Lavinia, my arms trembling under the weight of her limp body. It felt as though, if I relaxed my hold for even a fraction of a second, she would simply dissolve into the acrid smoke trailing out of the house behind us. I stumbled across the lawn, my boots sinking into the manicured turf that Caius had so meticulously maintained, a perfect lawn for a house of death. Lavinia had actually realized something was wrong earlier that night. She had sensed a metallic bitterness in her wine and secretly spat out the pill Caius had given her, feigning sleep to see what he would do. But the gas had been too much, eventually dragging her into a real, suffocating darkness. I lowered her onto the grass just as the paramedics reached us. "Move," I shouted, my voice cracking with a raw, desperate edge. "Breathe, Lavinia. Please don't leave me." I started to pump her chest, my hands shaking until a firm hand gripped my shoulder. Thaddeus stepped back. Helene Price commanded, her face a grim mask under the floodlights. "Let the professionals work. They've got her." I was forced away, but my eyes never left Lavinia's pale porcelain face. In the confusion, I felt the sharp edge of the phone I had scavenged from the cellar steps, Marsden's phone. I slipped it deep into my inner jacket pocket, the secret heat of that device feeling like a live coal against my ribs. I watched as they loaded her into the ambulance, the scent of ozone and burnt rubber hanging heavy in the air. A pulse. It was faint, a fragile stutter against the silence of the night, but it was there. I fought my way into the back of the ambulance, ignoring the protests of the GBI agents. I needed to be the first thing she saw. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick with the sterile, biting scent of rubbing alcohol and the hum of the heart monitor. Under the steady hiss of the oxygen mask, I saw her eyelids flicker. It was a slow, agonizing process, like a drowning victim surfacing from a deep, black lake. When her eyes finally opened, they were clouded with a terrifying haze of confusion. She looked at me, the father she had spent years hating, the man she had barred from her life, and I saw her fingers twitch toward mine. My own face was a ruin of soot and tears, the bitter taste of ash still coating my tongue. Dad. Why, she whispered, her voice barely a thread. Where is Caius? Why are you here? I caught her hand, her skin feeling as cold as the basement floor. You're safe now, I said, my voice dropping to a low, protective rumble. I'm right here. That man, hush, he isn't who you think he is. Everything you knew was a lie. She squeezed my hand, her nails digging into my palm with a sudden sharp intensity that spoke of a rising panic. Truth is like the flash of a camera, illuminating the darkness so suddenly it makes our eyes ache with the brilliance of it. Her breathing hitched the monitor, chirping more rapidly as she struggled to form words through the fog of the suppressant. He said a name. She hissed, her eyes wide and fixed on a point behind me. Before everything went dark, he whispered it into the phone. The architect. He said the architect wouldn't be happy about the delay. She began to shiver violently, her gaze shifting to the small window at the back of the ambulance. My heart hammered against my ribs as I followed her stare. Dad, that black truck, she whimpered, her voice rising in terror. It's been behind us since we left the driveway. It's following us. I watched the rearview mirror as the ambulance sped away, my hand instinctively brushing the cold weight of the handgun concealed beneath my jacket. The black truck eventually peeled off into the shadows of a side street, but the chill it left behind didn't dissipate. After handing Lavinia over to the emergency medical team at Savannah General under a heavy GBI guard, I found myself standing in the sterile, airless corridor of a temporary interrogation facility. The neon lights in the room were so harsh and cold that I felt as if my very breath was crystallizing into shards of broken glass. I swallowed a mouthful of lukewarm coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and bitter bile, trying to steady the tremors in my hands. Helene Price had allowed me to stand behind the one-way glass, a silent ghost, watching the man who had haunted my family's reality for far too long. Marsden Trent sat at the metal table, dried blood matting the hair on his forehead, but his eyes remained bright with a sickening, arrogant spark. He began to speak, his voice a low, rhythmic drone as he listed the staged murders from Philadelphia to Savannah, as if he were simply reciting a quarterly earnings report for a successful business venture. Every name he uttered was a fresh, jagged scar on my soul, a reminder of the innocent lives extinguished just to keep a corrupt ledger balanced. You want to know about Frank Trent? Asked, leaning forward with a terrifying intimacy. He died too fast, Thaddeus. It wasn't nearly as entertaining as I'd hoped it would be. Caius is just a greedy amateur, a pretty face for the paperwork. I'm the artist of the accident. It was then that the first real crack appeared in the narrative. Trent leaned back and smiled at the ceiling, revealing with a sharp, mocking laugh that he had been tipped off about the raid by one of Helene's own agents. He had stayed behind, specifically, to play with me a personal vendetta, born from some old slight I couldn't even recall in my current state of exhaustion. Are human lives truly nothing more to these monsters than convenient numbers on an insurance check? I gripped the edge of the observation ledge, the cold glass biting into my fingertips as I watched him toy with Helene like a predator playing with its food. The constant hum of the surveillance camera overhead felt like a swarm of angry hornets trapped inside my ears. Trent's voice suddenly dropped an octave, and he looked directly at the glass, his gaze piercing the reflection, as if he could see the raw rage boiling in my eyes despite the barrier between us. "You think saving the girl was the end of the game?" he asked, a jagged, wet laugh catching in his throat. "The clock is still ticking on the other side of town. Tonight wasn't just about Lavinia. There's a fourth victim, Thaddeus. Consider it a little parting gift for the old man." I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror wash over me. The fourth person was the anonymous informant who had led me to Caius in the first place. The one person who held the key to the insurance records that could bring the whole house of cards down. Trent leaned into the microphone, his grin widening to show his blood-stained teeth. "Right now, that snitch is locked inside an insurance archive warehouse where the air is being replaced by something much less breathable than oxygen." Tick-tock. It's starting all over again. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach, leaving me gasping for air in the cramped observation room. The person who had risked everything to help me was currently being erased in a meticulously planned toxic leak at the record facility. Marsden let out a wet, rattling chuckle and tapped a rhythmic beat with his finger against the metal table. "You want to know who the fourth one is, Thaddeus? Go ahead and ask your partner. He's the one who signed the work order to seal the room." I burst out of the interrogation room, my mind reeling with the names and lies that had sustained a decade of deception. The cold hallway air did nothing to soothe the fire in my blood. I thought I had looked into the deepest pit of rot within my daughter's marriage until a woman stepped out from the shadows of the precinct lobby, anchoring me with a stare that felt like a plea from the dead. She looked exhausted, her frame swallowed by an oversized coat, her face a map of dark circles and raw nerves. This was Adria Belen, a melancholic-looking woman with hollow eyes and a slight swell in her abdomen beneath her loose jacket, carrying a scent of cheap perfume mixed with the sharp sweat of genuine terror. I was mere feet away when I heard her frantic voice at the sergeant's desk. "I need to see Inspector Price," she gasped, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn leather wallet. "Right now, my life is in danger. Caius. He is not the only one. They will kill me for being the last thread." There was a desperate honesty in her eyes that Marsden and Caius lacked entirely. I realized then that Adria Belen was the source of the anonymous letters I had received. She hadn't sent them out of a noble heart, but out of a toxic brew of jealousy and the paralyzing fear of what Caius was becoming. We moved to Helene's office, the atmosphere thick with the smell of cold, stale coffee and the hum of flickering fluorescent lights. Adria sat on the edge of a chair, her breathing coming in ragged hitches. I watched her, my fingertips numb, feeling the bitter taste of a new betrayal coating my tongue. "I have been with Caius for 2 years. She whispered, the confession spilling out like blood from a wound. "He told me he loved me. He told me he would save me from the poverty that was drowning me. But it was all a calculation. He didn't just want Lavinia's insurance money to start a life with me in South America. He wanted the legacy." 4 months. The innocent child growing inside her was the living evidence of the most disgusting betrayal a man could inflict on a family. Adria began to sob, the hiccups racking her thin frame as the fluorescent light overhead buzzed like an angry insect. "He said we would be a family once he was free, but I found his notes," she said, her voice cracking. "He was planning to dispose of me, too. I was just the backup plan, a way to keep him occupied while he waited for his wife to die. And now that the GBI is involved, he sees me as a liability that needs to be erased. Do you think you have seen the worst of human nature? Just wait until you see Adria's face when she mentions who brought her into this circle." She reached into her coat, her movements jerky and frantic. My jaw tightened as she described how she was introduced to Caius. She wasn't some random encounter at a bar. She had been handpicked and presented to him by the very man Marsden had called the partner, the one who signed the orders and moved the pieces. Adria fumbled with her purse and finally pulled out a crumpled photograph. She laid it on the desk between us, her fingers smudging the glossy surface. It was a picture of her and Caius at a high-end gala, both of them smiling as if the world belonged to them. But my heart stopped when I looked at the background. Standing right behind them, holding a glass of champagne and wearing a calm, effortless smile, was the man I had called my brother-in-arms for 10 years. The man I had bled with, the one I had trusted to watch my back while I mourned Frank. He was the one who had choreographed the entire tragedy. The photograph slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. The world as I had known it for a decade shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces in that single moment. Standing behind Caius and Adria in that glossy image was Marcus Vance, a man I had called my brother-in-arms, the person who had held me up when I buried my wife and shared drinks with me while I mourned Frank. The betrayal was a physical weight, a sickening pressure in my chest that made every breath feel like inhaling glass. 2 weeks passed in a blur of sterile hospital corridors and quiet legal consultations before I finally brought Lavinia home. The door to our old family house groaned with a dry, hollow creak as I pushed it open, a sound that echoed the years of stagnant grief within these walls. But today, it was opening to receive a soul that had narrowly escaped the fires of hell. As I helped Lavinia unpack the few personal items she had left after the cellar explosion, she wandered into the storage basement. She emerged holding an old leather-bound volume, her mother's diary. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling as she showed me an entry from 10 years ago. Mom saw it even then. She wrote about her distrust of Marcus Vance, about how his eyes never matched his smile. She was going to tell me, but she never got the chance. The revelation hit me with a fresh wave of sorrow. The truth had been hiding in my own home while I was blind to it. We spent the next few days in a quiet rhythm of healing. I installed the most advanced security system money could buy, reinforcing every entrance. The air inside still smelled of old wood wax and the faint, comforting scent of dust. Yet a new tension hummed beneath the surface. Lavinia sat in the kitchen, staring at her tea, trying to reconcile the image of the man she loved with the monster who had tried to suffocate her. Memories are like shards of glass under a rug. They shimmer beautifully, but they will make you bleed if you step without caution. I spent my nights in my home office surrounded by stacks of files Helene Price had funneled to me. Every document, every crime scene photo from the past decade now pointed toward Marcus. This wasn't just about justice for Frank anymore. It was about ensuring Lavinia had a future where the shadows didn't have names. I stared at Marcus's face in the police records, his calm expression now looking like a predator's mask. "Marcus, 10 years of your lies is more than enough," I muttered to the cold, empty room. Tomorrow, the truth will no longer be an option. My focus was razor-sharp, a cold determination replacing the heat of my initial rage. As I prepared for the preliminary hearing, a courier arrived with an anonymous package. Inside was a digital recorder containing a single audio file, the final call Frank made before his car went over the bridge. It wasn't an accident. I heard Marcus's voice clear and chilling, giving the direct order to finish Frank, because he knew too much. 10 years. How can a man live under a mask of friendship for that long without choking on his own lies? The sheer endurance of his deception was as terrifying as the crimes themselves. It was late on the night before the trial when I stood before the mirror adjusting my tie. The silk felt cold against my throat like a noose. Suddenly, a dull thud echoed from the front of the house. I rushed to the living room and stopped dead. A dark, viscous streak of deep red was sliding down the window pane. A dead bird had been hurled against the glass. Below the smear of blood, a message had been scrawled in thick crimson strokes. "The witness will have no home to return to." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hand remained steady as I reached for my holstered weapon. Task 9.2. The gavel of the judge rang in my mind, even before I set foot in the courthouse. My heels struck the marble floors of the Chatham County Justice Center with a hollow resonance that sounded like funeral shots. Each step a silent act of defiance against the blood-red message left on my window. I walked with my shoulders squared, the weight of the handgun at my hip, a familiar comfort, as we moved through the metal detectors and into the heavy silence of the hallowed halls. Judge Miller, a man with a shock of white hair and a gaze as sharp as a scalpel, sat perched behind his bench, a figure known for his absolute intolerance toward domestic violence. I took the stand first, laying out the cold, hard facts of the betrayal, but the atmosphere turned electric when Caius Irvine tried to play his last card. He slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the ceiling, while his lawyer argued for a psychiatric delay. It was a pathetic performance, one I had already neutralized. I had provided the prosecution with medical files obtained from Adria Belen, proving Caius was not only sane, but had been meticulously documenting his plans for years. The judge's eyes narrowed, dismissing the theater of madness with a single cold stare. When it was time for Lavinia to testify, I felt a tremor of protective fear, but she didn't need me to shield her. She stood up with a poise that made the room go still. Her face pale, but her eyes filled with the iron of a woman who had died once and come back for more. She walked to the stand, the smell of polished oak and old law books hanging heavy in the air. "The defendant has the right to look at his victim," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the muffled whir of the overhead vents. "But does he have the courage?" Caius looked away, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as the reporter's cameras began to click in a frantic rhythm. Silence. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. I watched from the front row, my heart hammering against my ribs. Lavinia didn't look for pity. She reached into her folder and pulled out a small digital recorder. She explained how she had used my own surveillance equipment to record Caius on the night he thought she was unconscious. The recording began to play, and Caius's own voice filled the courtroom, cold and clinical, as he discussed her as nothing more than an insurance payout. "You said I was just a number, Caius," she stated as the audio died out, leaving a haunting vacuum in the room. "So watch how this number sends you to a cell. May God forgive you, because I will not." The jury sat in stunned disbelief, the evidence so damning that the defense lawyer simply sat back down, his face a mask of defeat. "Do you hear the sound of the judge's gavel? That is the sound of a coffin lid slamming shut on the future of a predator." After the jury deliberated for less than an hour, the verdict was read: life without the possibility of parole. There was no explosion of anger from Caius. Instead, he stood there with a terrifyingly calm, venomous smile playing on his lips. As the bailiffs moved in to shackle him, he leaned toward me. "Getting caught was just the settlement fee for someone much bigger," he whispered, his breath smelling of sour coffee. I felt a cold chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the courthouse air conditioning. The chaos erupted as reporters surged forward, flashes blinding us as Caius was led away. In the middle of the scramble, he managed to brush past me, his fingers slipping a tiny crumpled piece of paper into my jacket pocket. I waited until we were alone in the side corridor before I pulled it out. It was a set of GPS coordinates, followed by 5 chilling words, scrawled in a frantic hand, a gift from Marcus for the 4th one. The life sentence should have been the end, a definitive period at the end of a bloody sentence. But the slip of paper in my jacket pocket burned against my chest like a hot coal. Can an old soldier ever truly lay down his arms when the enemy is still whispering deathly coordinates into his ear? Or is peace merely a fragile intermission between 2 battles? I stood in the shadow of the Chatham County Courthouse. The midday sun felt cold on my skin as I unfolded the frantic scrawl. My mind raced back to the lectures on intuition I once gave to green recruits. I told them that technology is a mirror that can be tilted to show whatever lie the operator wants, but the cold dread in your marrow never lies. The coordinates Marcus had given me pointed to a desolate patch of marshland outside the city, A place I realized with a sudden jarring clarity was a mass grave. It was where Marcus had buried the inconvenient truths of a decade. He wanted me to go there to lose myself in the muck and the skeletons, to drown in a renewed cycle of vengeance that would eventually consume what was left of my soul. I looked toward the car where Lavinia sat, waiting, her silhouette a reminder of everything I had almost lost. I realized then that intuition isn't just about finding the enemy. It is about knowing when to stop being a hunter. "Your game ends here, Marcus," I whispered into the humid air. "I am no longer your pawn." I pulled out my phone and sent the coordinates to Helene Price through an encrypted GBI channel. With a deliberate, steady hand, I tore the paper into tiny white flakes that scattered in the wind like winter's first snow. Truth is like the tide. It has the power to wash away the filth of the past, but it also leaves jagged shells beneath your feet that can cut you if you aren't careful. A week later, the salt air of Tybee Island offered a different kind of sanctuary. I stood on the shore, the sand shifting and sinking beneath my boots, a physical manifestation of the unstable ground we had occupied for so long. The Atlantic stretched out before us, vast and indifferent to the petty cruelties of men. The scent of brine and pine needles filled my lungs, replacing the metallic tang of blood and hospital bleach. Lavinia walked beside me, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She stopped to pick up a piece of sea glass, turning it over in her palm. "You were right, Dad," she said, her voice barely carrying over the rhythm of the waves. "I trusted the algorithms. I trusted the smart locks and the synced calendars and the predictive data. I forgot how to listen to myself." She looked at me, and for the first time, the hollow shadow in her eyes had begun to recede. "We talked about Frank not as a victim of a staged accident, but as a man who loved the sea. We talked about a future built on honesty rather than insurance premiums and cold calculations. Do you hear the sound of the waves? It is the sound of the world erasing the footprints of sin on the sand." As we turned our backs to the ocean to head toward the dunes, a sudden flash of light caught the corner of my eye. It was a rhythmic glint, coming from a high-rise apartment balcony far down the coast. I didn't need a scope to know what it was, the unmistakable flare of a long-range camera lens catching the late afternoon sun. My heart, which had finally found a steady beat, flared with a familiar sharp warning. Lavinia didn't see it, but I did. She reached for my hand, her grip firm and real. I realized then that while Marcus Vance might be in the wind, the network that birthed him was still watching. She squeezed my hand and told me she had found something on Marsden's old phone before the police took it. Proof that Marcus had been monitoring our every word through the very smart devices we thought were keeping us safe. The war wasn't over. It had just changed shape. I have replayed those nights in my head more times than I can count. I thought I was protecting my daughter, but I nearly let anger and obsession turn me into something I didn't recognize. If there is one lesson I've learned, it's this: don't ignore your intuition, but don't let vengeance become your identity. Family betrayal is a wound that doesn't bleed on the outside. I face the deepest kind of family betrayal, the kind that smiles at dinner and plots in the dark. In many grandpa stories, the old man is wise, calm, always prepared. But real life humbles you. Even in grandpa stories, the grandfather can be manipulated, deceived, outplayed. The difference is whether he chooses bitterness or courage. I chose to fight, but I also learned to forgive myself for not seeing the signs sooner. Don't wait for disaster to ask hard questions. Talk to your children. Listen to that quiet alarm in your spirit. Systems fail. Technology lies. But truth eventually surfaces. I believe God allows storms not to destroy us, but to reveal who we truly are. This chapter of family betrayal taught me that survival isn't victory, integrity is. And if my story joins the long line of grandpa stories told around quiet tables, let it be remembered as a warning: love fiercely, but never blindly. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I've reframed perspectives and adjusted key variables for this version Be sure to change the bracketed elements in each upload to avoid repetitive formatting flags. Now tell me, what would you do if you were placed in this father's impossible choice? Share your thoughts below. If this story moved, you consider subscribing for future episodes. While inspired by real-life themes, some elements were dramatized for storytelling. If this isn't your style, feel free to explore other videos that suit you better.